I saw her from across the dark lobby, a little girl, standing near the book rack, reaching in like she was trying to pull out a book. The store was closed. The doors were locked. Nobody else was supposed to be there. I told my girlfriend, "There's somebody in the store." Then I walked around the corner, and there was no one there. A little girl in a closed store, an old downtown building after dark, and the first glimpse of something that may have been there for a long time before the music shop ever moved in. And that's where we'll begin tonight. For as long as I can remember, I've been collecting stories that don't fit. Ghosts, UFOs, strange creatures, glitches in reality, the unexplained and the deeply unsettling. For decades, I've sought out these stories, listened to the people who experienced them, and written them down. I'm Scott Weimer, and this is The Ghost Collector. Tonight's first story takes us into an old downtown building with a long history, a music store that stayed there for 4 years, and a shop owner who says the strange activity was not limited to one room, one night, or one witness. There was the little girl near the book rack, an old church organ that seemed to knock from the inside, employees who ran from the building and refused to come back, investigators who claimed they heard voices upstairs, and something may have followed one visitor home. This is Dale's story. I owned a music store downtown, in an old building called the Simon Building. I was there for about 4 years, and during that time there were so many strange things that happened that I could probably talk about it for hours. It wasn't just one story. It was little things, big things, things I saw, things my employees saw, things customers reacted to, and even things ghost investigators claimed they recorded inside the building. But one of the first things that really stuck with me happened one night after hours. I was downstairs in the lobby area with my girlfriend. The store was closed, everything was dark, and we were the only ones supposed to be there. Or at least I thought we were. At one point I looked over and saw what appeared to be a little girl near a book rack. She was reaching into it like she was looking for a book or trying to pull something out. I said to my girlfriend, "Oh, there's someone in the store." That was my first thought. Not ghost, not anything paranormal. Just that somehow somebody had gotten inside. Maybe it was somebody's kid. Maybe an employee had come by and brought a child with them. Something like that. So I walked around the corner to see who it was. And she was gone. Just gone. There were t-shirt racks right there, so I thought maybe she was hiding inside. I checked around them. I checked inside. I looked through the area. I expected to find a child crouched behind something, maybe playing around or scared because she realized she'd been seen. But there was nothing. No little girl, no footsteps, no door opening, nothing. That was one of the first things I saw there, and it definitely wasn't the last. At one point, a woman called me and said she had an organ she wanted to get rid of. It had belonged to her husband, who had been a pastor, and he had used it in a church for years. After he passed away, she still had it, and she told me she wanted it out of her house because it was making strange noises. I thought maybe she just didn't want it around anymore, or maybe it had some mechanical issue. It was a small organ, and she said I could just have it. So we brought it down to the shop, and sure enough, it started making noise. It would bang from the inside. Not creak, not settle, not hum, but loud bangs. I took the back off and looked inside because I figured there had to be something loose in there. Maybe some part that was shifting around. Maybe a rat had gotten into it. Something had to be making that sound. It wasn't plugged in. It wasn't moving, and would make these loud bangs. But there was nothing inside that could explain it. One day a woman was up in the front register with her 2 kids, and the organ started knocking. She heard it and asked, "What is that noise?" I said, "Oh, it's just that old organ over there. It makes noise inside." She said, "You have an organ?" I told her, "Yeah, it makes this banging noise, but I took the back off and there's nothing in there." She walked over to it, curious, and right as she got close, something inside hit hard. She grabbed her kids and said something like, "Kids, we're out of here." And they left, and they never came back. That was when I started learning not to tell customers too much about the weird things that happened in that building. Another time, I was at home when I got a phone call from the store. I had 3 employees working that day, and when I answered, they were screaming and crying into the phone. At first, I thought the store had been robbed or something. I jumped into my car and flew down there as fast as I could. When I got there, all 3 of them were standing outside. I asked them what was going on. They said there was something inside the store, and they had locked it in there. I said, "What do you mean, something?" They said they had heard a huge growling sound from inside the store, and they were scared out of their minds. One of the girls, Janelle, had only worked there a couple of days. I remember trying to calm her down. I said, "Janelle, come on, you just started working here. We've got to go back inside." She said, "I'm not going back in there," and she quit on the spot. She told me she wasn't coming back, and she didn't even care about picking up her paycheck. I called her a couple times after that, asking if she was coming back to work. She never returned my calls, and I never saw her again. That building had a way of doing that to people. There were ghost investigators that came through too. Not just one group. There were a few different people over the years. Some were local people who just wanted to see if they could scare up a ghost. And then there was one larger team that came all the way from Sacramento. That group had about 10 people, and they brought a lot of equipment, little red wagons full of electronic gear. They wanted to stay inside the building overnight, so I locked them in from about 10 at night till about 6 in the morning. I had to lock them in because there was inventory in the store. They claimed they were communicating with spirits upstairs. They recorded voices, and they played some of them for me. I remember being able to hear what sounded like quiet human voices answering questions. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet voices, but clear enough that you could hear responses. And even with all their equipment and all their confidence, a couple of the newer people on the team didn't make it through the night. Around midnight, they called and said they wanted out. So I had to go back down to the building and let them out. There were things I saw outside the store too. One day I was coming in through the back door. It was kind of drizzly outside, and there was an old man leaning against a pole in the alley. But the way he was dressed caught my attention. He looked like someone from another time. The closest way I can describe it is that he looked like an old train conductor from the 1800s. Old overalls, old flannel type shirt, just this older gentleman who looked down on his luck. As I was going in the door, he suddenly started screaming.
"Don't hurt me! Don't hurt me!"
At first, I thought maybe he was sick or confused or scared of something, so I ran back around the corner to check on him. And he was gone. I ran to the end of the alley, looking for him because there was no way he could have walked out of sight that quickly. At least that's what my mind kept trying to figure out. He had to have gone somewhere. But I couldn't find him. He had just vanished. Another night, we had band practice in the store, and one of my employees, Mike, had his own experience. We had locked the store up like we always did during practice, because we didn't want people wandering in after hours asking what was going on. Mike suddenly jumped up and turned white. He was pointing across the store, completely freaked out, saying he had been looking right at a man who disappeared. He kept saying, "I swear I was looking right at him," and he just disappeared. He described him as an old man inside the store. But the doors were locked, and there was nobody there. At one point, things got strange enough that I brought in a local pastor from a spiritual church. Her name was Gail, and I took her through the larger parts of the building. Not just my store, but some of the old upstairs areas too. Above that part of the building, over what had been a pizza parlor, there were old apartments that had been abandoned for years. It was already a creepy area, even before anything happened. Old rooms, old hallways, everything empty and dark. We were walking through that section when Gail was behind me and suddenly fell into me. I turned around and said, "Hey, are you okay?" She said, "Something just pushed me." Then she said, "They know we're here, and they know what we're doing." That was one of those moments where even I started to get a creepy feeling. Because when someone comes in to bless a place or clear a place or whatever you want to call it, and then says something there knows why she came, it changes the feeling in the room. There was also a time when 2 amateur ghost hunters came into the shop. Monica and Tina. They wanted to be Ghostbusters, basically. They came in and did all kinds of ghost hunting stuff. I don't remember exactly what they saw or didn't see in my shop that night, but apparently something followed Monica home. Monica's husband knew nothing of the stories from the store, at least not the specific details. He was awoken one night to the sound of little footsteps running up to the bed. A little girl in pigtails asked him to play in the middle of the night. They wanted that ghost out of their house. So I connected her with Gail, the pastor from the spiritual church, and as far as I know, they did something that got rid of it. That's what it was like in the Simon building. It wasn't one clean story with a beginning, middle, and end. It was 4 years of things happening. A little girl reaching into a book rack after hours and disappearing. An old church organ begging from the inside. Employees running out of the store and refusing to come back. Ghost hunters hearing noises upstairs. And an old man in the alley begging not to be hurt, and then vanishing in the rain. And after a while, you stopped asking whether the building was haunted. You just started wondering who or what you were going to run into next. There's something different about a building like that. When one person sees something, you can wonder if they were tired or mistaken, or maybe they just caught a shadow at the wrong angle. But when the story starts stacking up, a little girl in the store, an old man in the alley, voices upstairs, employees running out, investigators asking to be let out in the middle of the night, the building itself starts to feel like a witness. And sometimes that's all a ghost story needs to survive. A place, a few witnesses, and a handful of details that refuse to disappear. Which brings us to another installment of what I've started calling lost ghost stories. These are the stories that were told once or twice years ago. Stories that were passed along at work or around a dinner table, or in a late night conversation, and then almost vanished. The people who told them may be gone, or the details may have faded, but something at the center of the story remained. This next story takes us to Portland, Oregon, and one of the city's most famous haunted hotels, the Heathman. More specifically, to a room beside one of the hotel's most infamous rooms, room 703. The Heathman Hotel in Portland, Oregon has long carried a haunted reputation, particularly the rooms ending in 03. According to the legend, a guest once fell to his death from room 703, and whatever remained of him never quite left the hotel. Guests and employees have since reported doors that refused to open, objects moving in empty rooms, and strange voices heard along the upper floors. Years ago, my friend Will and his wife Irene stayed at the Heathman. They were both interested in the paranormal, but this wasn't an investigation. They hadn't requested one of the haunted rooms, and they hadn't brought cameras, recorders, or any other equipment. They were simply spending a couple nights. But when they arrived, they discovered the room was directly beside room 703, and they knew the reputation. The details of what followed have faded over time, but 3 moments remained with them. At one point, Irene noticed movement in the corner of their room. She looked over and saw what appeared to be a shape of someone rising from a chair, but there was no one there. Later that night, both Will and Irene awoke to steady tapping against the wall. Not 1 or 2 knocks, but constant tapping. And on the other side of that wall was room 703. Then came the final incident. Sometime during the night, Will awoke to the sound of screaming. It seemed distant, as though it were coming from somewhere far away inside the hotel. Faint, echoing, but unmistakable. He couldn't tell where it was coming from. Maybe it was another guest. Maybe it was only a sound carried strangely through an old building. Or maybe it was something else. An echo, somehow still trapped inside the Heathman. The final sound of a man falling from room 703. Some hauntings seem tied to a room. A number on a door, a wall shared with the wrong space, a sound from the other side that makes you wonder what happened there, and what might still be reaching through. But other stories don't feel tied to a room at all. They feel tied to the land, to a road, a reservoir, a shoreline, a place where something was changed so completely that whatever came before it seemed to echo underneath. Our next story moves away from hotels and locked rooms and out into the open, to a dam, a body of water, and a sound that should have not been there. This is Echoes Beyond the Dam, and is told by Trevor. This happened when I was about 10 or 11 years old. When I was a kid, my family used to camp at a reservoir up in the foothills. We had a spot we liked in the very back of the lake, up on a hill where you could look down over the water. From there, if you looked off to the right, you could see just past the small dam and out into the stretch of open country beyond it. Back then, that land was still wild-looking. It wasn't forested or dramatic in the way people usually picture wilderness. It was more like dry foothill country. Yellow grass, scrub brush, little cuts and ravines running through the ground. Shallow gullies carved by rainwater, twisting through the hillsides like old scars. In the summer, everything out there looked sunburned and empty. On one of those camping trips, my grandfather took me hiking on the other side of the dam. My grandfather was one of those older men who seemed to know things without making a big production out of it. He was quiet, but when he talked, you listened. He had some Native American ancestry, Choctaw if I remember correctly, and he had spent part of his childhood in Oklahoma around reservation life. I don't completely understand all the family history there, and I wouldn't want to overstate it, but I do know he had a real respect for those old traditions and stories. That day, as we walked down into those gullies, he talked to me about the old ways. I wish I could remember everything he said. I don't. I was just a kid, and this was more than 50 years ago now. But I remember the feeling of it. The two of us walking through that dry, quiet country, with the lake behind us and the campground getting farther and farther away. He seemed to know exactly where he was going. And being a shorter kid, I was lost in the maze of tall gullies. I could imagine water rushing through them in rainy season. We followed one gully, then another, dropping down into places where you really couldn't see from up above. The walls rose around us in places, not high like a canyon, but high enough that the wind quieted down and the rest of the world felt farther away. Eventually, we came to a small cave or hollow set into the side of one of those gullies. It wasn't big, not the kind of cave you would explore with flashlights and ropes and helmets. It was more like shallow shelter, carved into the earth and stone, just large enough for a few people to sit inside. And my grandfather took me in there. I remember the air felt cooler. I remember the smell of dirt and old stone. He pointed out marks on the walls that he told me were old native markings. He showed me dark stains on the ceiling and told me they were from smoke, from fires that had been burned there a long time ago. To me, at that age, it felt like we had found something hidden. Not a tourist site, not a place with a sign or a fence, just a small, forgotten pocket of the old world that my grandfather somehow knew was there. We sat inside for a while and he talked. And then something strange happened. I started to hear voices. Not clear voices, not words I could understand. It was more like chanting or singing or a low murmur coming from somewhere beyond us. It didn't sound like people walking nearby. It didn't sound like campers or boats on the lake or anyone calling from the dam. It sounded older than that. I know that probably doesn't make sense, but that's how I remember it. For a moment, the light outside the mouth of the cave seemed to change. The whole world felt still, like time had thinned out somehow, and we were hearing something that had already happened long before we got there. I don't remember my grandfather acting surprised, and that might be the strangest part. I remember him being calm. Maybe he heard it too, or maybe he just saw that I had heard it. I don't know. I wish I could ask him now, but I can't. The moment passed. The light went back to normal, or at least it seemed to. The sounds faded, and eventually we got up and hiked back to camp. For years, that little cave stayed in my mind. But as strange as that experience was, it wasn't the part of the trip that my family talked about later. That came either that night or the next. We were asleep in our trailer when I woke up to my father and my uncle talking excitedly near the door. At first, I didn't know what was going on. I was still half asleep, lying there in the dark, listening to their voices. Then I heard the trailer door open, and I heard them step outside. And that was when I heard it too. A train. Not just any train. It was the sound of an old steam locomotive moving through the night. There was a whistle. Long and distant, but clear. Then the rhythmic chugging sound, the kind you associate with old movies and railroad museums. It wasn't faint enough to dismiss. It was loud and it sounded real. And it sounded like it was coming from beyond the lake, just out past the dam. My father and my uncle were both huge train buffs. They knew trains, they loved trains, they read the books, and from the excitement in their voices, I could tell they thought they were about to see something special. Maybe some old locomotive being moved at night, or some kind of historic engine running through the tracks behind the reservoir. There were tracks out there. I knew that because at some point we had driven on a dirt road behind the lake, near those tracks. My father had even shown me a spot near an old water tank where several famous westerns had been filmed. I remember him pointing and saying something like, "That's the back of the lake way over there." So when we heard that train, it made sense where it might be coming from. The problem was, from where our trailer was parked up on that hill, my father and uncle had a clear view across the dark country beyond the dam. They could see the area where the tracks ran. They should have been able to see a train, especially if it was close enough for us to hear so clearly. But there was nothing there. No headlight, no movement, no engine, no train cars. Just the sound of a locomotive moving through the darkness. I stayed in bed, listening. I didn't get up and go outside, and part of me has always regretted that. But I could hear that train clearly from the inside of the trailer. I could hear the whistle. I could hear that old chugging sound. And I could hear my father and uncle outside, their excitement turning into confusion. They kept talking back and forth, trying to make sense out of it. They knew those tracks. They knew that line. According to my uncle, there should not have been a train running there at that hour. It was a small agricultural line that ran toward the valley, maybe 10 miles away. Trains did use it, but not often, and not in the middle of the night, and definitely not a steam locomotive. That sound eventually faded. Not like a train passed in front of us and moved on. More like it drifted away into the night, until there was nothing left but the normal quiet of the campground. My father and uncle stood outside for a long time afterward, talking about it. By morning, they were still talking about it. They were convinced they had heard a phantom train, some echo from another time, running along those tracks 100 years earlier. And because of who they were, because they knew trains and because they were not the type to turn every little noise into a ghost story, I believed them. And I still do. For decades after that, every time I drove past that reservoir, I thought about that trip. I thought about the train whistle in the night. But even more than that, I thought about the cave that my grandfather took me to. That small hidden place in the gullies, with the markings on the wall and the smoke stains overhead. I thought about the strange voices I had heard there, and the way the light seemed to change. One day, years later, I finally decided to go back. I paid the day-use fee and drove to the back of the lake. It was a weekday and the place was empty. I was pretty excited. I knew I probably wouldn't find the exact place again, but I really wanted to stand there. I wanted to look out past that dam and see those gullies again. At first, everything near the lake looked familiar, but when I hiked up to the dam and looked over the other side, my heart sank. It was gone. The wild grass, the scrubland, the maze of gullies, all of it had been leveled. The land had been flattened and planted with orchards. The place where my grandfather and I had walked had been erased. Maybe the cave was still there somewhere, buried or hidden along the edge of the new fields. Maybe it was destroyed. I'll probably never know. But I stood there for a while looking over that changed land, and I felt like I had lost something I didn't even fully understand. A hidden cave, a voice from the past, a phantom train moving through the dark beyond the dam, and a piece of the world my grandfather had shown me, gone before I ever thought to ask him how to find it again. Thanks to Trevor for sharing that story. There's something especially haunting about places that seem to hold on to what happened there. Not a room, not a house, not a single object left behind, but the land itself. A cave where people may have once gathered. A quiet place where someone might have camped, listened, waited, or passed through long before anyone living now could remember them. And then years later, the sound of a train where no train should have been. Maybe stories like that stay with us because they suggest that the past doesn't always disappear. Sometimes it echoes. Those are the stories people carry with them. The ones they don't always tell at work, or at parties, or maybe even to their own families. Some are terrifying, some are quiet, some are just strange enough that years later, you still find yourself asking, what did I actually experience? You can send your stories to scott@theghostcollector.com. I would love to tell your story on the air. Thanks for listening to The Ghost Collector. I'm Scott Weimer. And if you've been carrying a story you can't explain, maybe it's time to let someone collect it. For additional details, photos, and links to tonight's stories, please visit theghostcollector.com. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen. Music and sound effects used in this episode were sourced from freesound.org and are licensed under Creative Commons Attribution. Full source details are available at theghostcollector.com. Thanks for listening.